Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me to present this concept to you today. I entitled this presentation as More Green from the Greens, an introduction to payments for ecosystem services. This is a pun that I use just because PES uses incentives as a way to generate even more benefits from the already generous environment in which we benefit from. But before we talk about payments for ecosystem services or PES, let's talk first about the ecosystem service itself. So, what are ecosystem services? Many of you probably already know what ecosystem services are. But for those who are not aware, ecosystem services are simply the direct and or indirect benefits that we get from the ecosystem. You see, each unit of space across the world has different characteristics, be it biological, physical, natural, artificial, social, and even economic. Hence, each unit of space are filled differently. Now, spaces occupied by different ecosystems provide what we call ecosystem services. And the state of these spaces are called conditions. Now, if these ecosystem conditions are well and healthy, in a sense, we can expect continuous provision of ecosystem services. The reverse is also true that when these ecosystem conditions are unwell or unhealthy, then the ecosystem services are degraded as well, which affects us negatively, affects the human well-being negatively. Now, so each unit of space in one way or another affects us depending on its condition. Now, since these ecosystem conditions occur within spatial units, understanding its spatial information allows us to see the placement and connection of the rest of the world, of the ecosystem, the watershed, and even us and the society, and how it directly links to the societal well-being. For example, while we think that activities in the mountain areas do not really affect those that are in the coastal, we might have to rethink because looking at it holistically, they are actually affecting each other because of the upstream to downstream continuum. So these effects can manifest in the form of ecosystem services. A good ecosystem service, a good ecosystem upstream would provide good ecosystem services, and a bad ecosystem upstream would have a disservice. Now, again, just to reiterate, what are ecosystem services? Simply put, these are just the benefits now that we receive from the ecosystem that affects our well-being. Hence, it is really important for us to understand the condition of these ecosystems and to quantify these ecosystem services so that we can properly manage them. Now, we know that diverse ecosystems thrive in different watersheds, in a watershed, no? And therefore, there is a direct relationship between the state of the watershed, how the watershed is utilized, how the state of the ecosystem services are, and human well-being. But we also know that there are increasing demand and economic activities which threatens these watershed, depending on land use change, practices that are implemented, utilization of resources, and all those affect the health and integrity of the ecosystem services, and eventually affects human well-being. Now, to address this, one approach is to implement conservation programs, which aims to conserve the health and integrity of the ecosystems. Hence, to ensure that the continuous provision of ecosystem services are continuously being provided. Now, one of the widely adopted programs is the development of what we call the sustainable financing mechanism, which allows a continuous flow of financial resources or resources in general to support the implementation of these conservation programs. Now, there are many types of sustainable financing mechanism, and one that is widely and globally accepted and practiced is what we call the Payments for Ecosystem Services, or the PES. So, what is PES? Basically, PES is a type of market-based mechanism. It is a market-based mechanism because it uses incentives, or it incentivizes stakeholders to adopt sustainable practices in lieu of the conventional economic or production-centered utilization. Well, in its strictest sense, the PES scheme, a PES scheme, or Payments for Ecosystem Services scheme, sometimes it's called Payments for Environmental Services scheme. Um, in the strictest sense, it has to be a voluntary transaction. It has to have a well-defined environmental service, or a form of land use that secures the service. And it has to be bought by at least one ecosystem service buyer from a minimum of one ecosystem service provider. And now this is very important, that PES will only happen if and only if the provider continuously supplies that service to the buyers. Um, Most often, the case is that upstream communities, for example, in this diagram that we have, this is like a common setup or framework for a PES. So most often, the case is that upstream communities here do conservation, or they will adapt sustainable practice to conserve the ecosystem service upstream. Of course, with the expectation that an intact and well-managed ecosystem upstream will produce services that are beneficial to downstream communities. Now, the problem is because these conservation programs entail costs as well, then the upstream community, for them to be able to implement that, they would need resources. Now, the role of the downstream communities um, here is to support those upstream communities by providing the resources that they need so that they can implement these conservation program. Now, when I talk about resources, in the context of PES, most often the resources in the context of PES are in the form of financial resources. So that's why um, it's considered as a revenue generating activity. But in the strictest sense, it could also be any other resource. So it could be effort, it could be time, it could be machinery, capital, um, materials. Any resources that could help in implementing the conservation programs. But now, as PES evolves and being adapted in many different contexts, sometimes all these five um, um, characteristics doesn't necessarily apply. So as PS evolves, these conditions may not necessarily apply. Most often, one or more of these characteristics are being relaxed, making it, instead of a PES, it becomes a PES-like mechanisms. Um, so PES is theoretically simple. It's just a cycle. Basically, we have the ecosystem service providers, or the ecosystem service sellers, ensures the continuous provision of the ecosystem or ecosystem service products by maintaining healthy ecosystems through conservation practices. On the other hand, we have here the buyers, or the ecosystem service beneficiaries, provide support by compensating their efforts in exchange for implementing the conservation practices. Now, one key thing in the PES is the use of legally binding agreement. So this becomes influential in implementing the PES, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, the entire mechanism intends to have a continuous flow of financial resources, or any resources in general, to fuel programs towards strategic key conservation areas and practices. But it looks simple, but it becomes complicated when you actually look at the details. So for a feasible PES to materialize, it is actually important to understand a couple of things. Um, so it becomes more complicated when you needed to have to identify what are the key elements. What are who are the buyers, who are the sellers, what are the institutions involved. So those are key elements. It needs to identify also what are the priority ecosystems, and what are the priority ecosystem services that you need to uh, that you need to um, that you need to conserve. And then, what resources can we utilize? Can it even be operationalized? And do we need legally binding frameworks, or a simple term agreement could work? Um, would it need to have a legal contract? Um, who maintains and claims roles and responsibilities depending on the property rights, and so on. So some fundamental steps to create a feasible PES design are to um, I, enumerated here, as I enumerated here, would be identify key elements such as the buyers and the sellers of the ecosystem service of a specific ecosystem service that are being produced, and which leads to there is a need to establish this ecological linkage, hence the need to spatially attribute um, these ecosystem services between buyers and sellers. Um, these Establishing this kind of linkage also proves that the sellers are capable of providing these ecosystem services. Now, knowing this, there is also a need to determine if the subject ecosystem service is something that the recipients or the buyers would be willing to pay for, or or the buyers value these ecosystem service. So it determines if the buyers would also have the capacity to support, and if the support is enough for the sellers to really engage in those programs. So those are the some of the fundamental things that we need to consider when establishing the PES. Now, PS is not entirely new and have proven to have had success in different parts of the world. So I post only 3 cases here that I have encountered and I have had experience with on the different styles of doing PES. One is in Costa Rica, um, which they base their PES collection from opportunity cost of land use change, meaning they priced the collectibles from the program based on the value of the land that will be lost if it will be converted to the next best alternative. Meaning, if they have a forest land and it converts into a residential land, what would be the value of that residential land if it's going to be sold, and um, that will be now the price that they are going to collect in order to support um, that specific forest land. Now, on the other hand, Brazil had a PES where the responsibility of payments were under the water utility fees, meaning they added an additional collection from households that consumes water on top of their water bill, and then that added amount will be solely spent to support conservation programs upstream. And finally, in the Philippines, where I was part of, we had PES. We've established a PES where organizations like cooperatives, private organizations would voluntarily provide funds through corporate social responsibility to upstream communities so that they will be able to implement their conservation programs and improve the upstream ecosystems. Now, in the US, there are already PES being implemented. There's a lot of PES already here in the US, such as in New York City, in Chesapeake Bay, and different PES-like mechanism. Actually, conservation programs from NRCS like EQIP or WRP, those actually resembles PES-like mechanisms. One of the key difference, though, in those NRCS programs is that PES usually targets on a watershed or landscape level, while NRCS programs are primarily focused on landowners or farms. So, um, main key takeaway here that is that it is without question that development and economic growth is important for societal progress, but the increasing rate of economic progress compromise the quality of the environment and in turn affecting the ecosystem and ecosystem services. So because of that, it efforts such as the PES promises innovative solutions to counter that kind of effect. Also, holistic approaches in landscape management and conservation is becoming more popular and seeing its essential place in management. And hence the emerging importance of approaches like PES because PES looks at it on a holistic perspective. And finally, just to reiterate the key fundamental principles of establishing PES is that um, one of the main thing is that it needs to have a direct linkage between the ecosystem and human well-being. Now, this manner, when we establish the direct linkage, the society now sees the ecosystems, the importance of the ecosystems for its value and not just in it for its characteristic, and that its value has a direct affiliation to the societal well-being. Um, so that's all for me, and thank you. And you may reach me in these emails below. And if you'd like to discuss more, or if you have any questions about this presentation or even about payments for ecosystem services. Thank you and good day. Maraming salamat.